For the better part of modern history, the West has carried itself with an aura of invincibility. It has projected its culture, its politics, its financial systems, and its values across the globe, with such force that many believed its dominance was a permanent feature of the world order. From the end of the Second World War through the long decades of the Cold War and even into the 21st century, the West defined progress, dictated the rules of trade, and maintained an image of unshakable supremacy. The skyscrapers of New York, the parliaments of Europe, the universities of London and Paris, these became the icons of leadership, the benchmarks of success. Nations around the globe were conditioned to look toward the West as the center of gravity. But illusions, no matter how deeply entrenched, eventually collide with reality. And this is precisely where the West stands today. The first crack in this illusion is the mounting debt crisis that haunts Western economies. Governments have for decades chosen the easy path of borrowing, spending, and printing money to solve immediate political challenges while ignoring the long-term consequences. What began as a manageable strategy to stimulate growth has transformed into an addiction that no leader seems willing to break. The result is an economic architecture sitting on trillions of dollars of liabilities. Behind the polished speeches and reassurances, the truth is stark. The financial empire of the West is now leaning heavily on a crumbling foundation. Each new crisis, whether a banking collapse, a pandemic, or a geopolitical shock, is met with more printing, more borrowing, and more denial, deepening the fragility instead of correcting it. But debt is not the only symptom. Inflation is gnawing away at the standard of living in ways that were once thought unimaginable. The West, which prided itself on stability, now finds its citizens questioning whether their savings, pensions, or paychecks have any real value left. Prices of food, energy, housing, once steady anchors of daily life, are now unpredictable storms. Middle-class families, the very backbone of Western identity, are being hollowed out when ordinary citizens can no longer trust that their hard work will secure their future. The myth of supremacy begins to disintegrate from within. Alongside these economic tremors comes the political paralysis. The West has always boasted of its democratic models as superior systems of governance. But in recent years, those very systems have been hijacked by division, polarization, and a relentless cycle of short-term politics. Leaders rise not by solving long-term issues, but by exploiting temporary anger. Entire nations are gridlocked in debates that produce more noise than solutions. Governments lurch from crisis to crisis without strategy, while rival blocs outside the West observe with both astonishment and opportunity. The machinery that once impressed the world with efficiency and vision is now reduced to dysfunction, leaving citizens disillusioned and rivals emboldened. Another layer of the illusion is the assumption that cultural influence guarantees permanent dominance. Western films, music, brands, and technology still flow around the globe, but influence does not equal control. Global audiences are now far more selective, far more connected, and far more aware of alternatives. The new generation does not see Western products or narratives as the only option. They see them as one among many. Rising nations are exporting their own media, their own technology, their own cultural values, creating a multipolar environment where Western supremacy is no longer unquestioned. This cultural erosion may be subtle, but it is profound. Because once the aura of inevitability around Western leadership fades, the psychological grip that held much of the world in place vanishes with it. Technology, Once the sharpest weapon in the West's arsenal has also become a contested battlefield. The illusion was that Silicon Valley and European research institutions would always be the uncontested centers of innovation. But the acceleration of research hubs in Asia, the explosion of homegrown tech companies in emerging markets, and the relentless investment into artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotech outside Western borders have shattered this belief. The innovation is no longer geographically monopolized. It is distributed, it is global, and it is increasingly led by those who were once dismissed as imitators rather than innovators. The balance of technological power is tilting, and with it goes one of the strongest pillars of Western confidence. Geopolitically, the West assumed that its military alliances and influence over global institutions would remain the unchallenged rules of the game. NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, these were the tools through which the West not only projected strength, but enforced its vision of order. Yet what happens when other nations build parallel structures, form new alliances, and conduct trade outside Western rules? What happens when sanctions, once the ultimate weapon of control, lose their sting because alternative systems have been built to absorb the impact? The illusion of eternal geopolitical supremacy collapses, leaving the West facing a reality it had long refused to imagine, that others can and will create worlds where Western approval is no longer a prerequisite. This unraveling of supremacy is not a sudden collapse, but a steady erosion. Illusions rarely shatter in a single blow. They fade through a series of undeniable truths that can no longer be ignored. Citizens feel the change in their daily struggles with rising costs. Businesses sense it when trade routes shift and competitors emerge from unexpected places. Governments confront it when their sanctions, warnings, and policies are met with defiance rather than compliance. And the rest of the world perceives it when the once commanding voice of the West begins to sound more like an echo of the past than the vision of the future. It is important to recognize that the illusion of supremacy was sustained not just by real strength, but also by perception. The West mastered the art of narrative, telling itself and the world that its way was the only way, that its dominance was natural, inevitable, and permanent. But narratives require credibility, and credibility requires performance. When performance declines, when economies wobble, when politics fragment, when innovation shifts, the narrative collapses. What remains is exposure, the reality that supremacy was never permanent, only conditional on the ability to adapt and renew. The West for too long has relied on its past achievements as though they were a guarantee of future security. That belief was the heart of the illusion. Now, as the 21st century advances, the illusion is not only cracking, it is disintegrating. What is emerging in its place is a world no longer willing to accept Western dominance as a given. The stage is being reset. The actors are changing. And the script is no longer written in Western capitals. For those who still cling to the illusion, the disillusionment will be painful. For those who see through it, the cracks are already wide enough to reveal an unmistakable truth. The supremacy that once felt eternal is now little more than a memory held together by habit and denial. For almost a century, the US dollar has reigned as the undisputed king of global trade. It has been the currency of oil, of gold, of international debt, of cross-border settlements, and of trust itself. Nations measured their reserves in dollars. Companies invoiced in dollars. And central banks treated the greenback as the ultimate guarantee of stability. The dollar was not just paper, it was power. Whoever controlled the dollar controlled the veins of global commerce. And for decades, this truth allowed the West to dominate not just economies, but entire governments, entire continents. Yet as history has shown again and again, no throne remains unshaken forever. The signs of fragility are now too visible to ignore, and the dollar's dominance is facing pressures that are no longer whispers on the margins, but roars from the core of the global system. The dollar's rise to supremacy was built on both trust and necessity. After World War II, with the Bretton Woods system in place, nations needed a stable anchor, and the United States provided exactly that. Its economy was strong, its institutions were reliable, and its gold reserves were unparalleled. The dollar became the bedrock upon which the world rebuilt itself. Even after Bretton Woods collapsed in the 1970s, the so-called petrodollar system ensured that energy, the most vital commodity on earth, was priced and sold in dollars. Every nation needed oil, and therefore every nation needed dollars. This mechanism locked the world into a cycle where demand for the dollar was eternal. It was a cycle that gave America and its Western allies extraordinary leverage. Sanctions became lethal, loans became chains, and dollar liquidity became a weapon of control. This was not mere economics. It was geopolitics disguised in the language of finance. But the same mechanism that built the dollar's dominance is now eroding it. Nations have grown weary of depending on a currency that comes with condition. They see how sanctions can freeze their reserves overnight, how trade restrictions can paralyze their economies, and how reliance on a single currency leaves them vulnerable to decisions made in Washington rather than their own capitals. The dollar, once a symbol of security, has become a reminder of dependency, and dependency breeds resistance. The more it is enforced, the more urgent the search for alternatives becomes. In recent years, that search has taken on tangible form. Countries once content to operate within the dollar system are now signing deals in their own currencies. Energy giants are accepting payments in yuan, rubles, or rupees. Regional blocs are experimenting with digital settlement systems that bypass the dollar entirely. Even nations historically aligned with the West are hedging their bets, quietly increasing trade in non-dollar currencies as a form of insurance against future uncertainty. What was once unthinkable is now becoming normalized. Every non-dollar transaction chips away at the aura of inevitability surrounding the greenback, turning what was once an unassailable fortress into a contested battleground. The fragility is compounded by internal weaknesses within the United States itself. The dollar's strength is supposed to reflect the strength of the American economy, but that economy is weighed down by debt, deficits, and declining trust in governance. Trillions are borrowed with no credible plan for repayment. Political dysfunction threatens to shut down government operations. Inflation surges and interest rates fluctuate wildly, sending shockwaves across global markets. When the world watches the very foundation of the dollar tremble under domestic instability, faith begins to erode. For decades, the dollar's supremacy was not just about economics, but about the perception that America was stable, responsible, and reliable. That perception is no longer unquestioned. The rise of alternatives is not a hypothetical. It is already happening. The BRICS nations, representing some of the largest economies on earth, are actively working on mechanisms to trade outside the dollar. Discussions of a BRICS currency or basket system may still be in their infancy, but the intent is clear. Reduce exposure to the dollar. Even more threatening is the role of digital currencies and blockchain systems. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, spearheaded by nations like China, represent a technological leap that could circumvent traditional dollar-dominated systems like SWIFT. If oil, minerals, and manufactured maneuvers can be traded through new digital frameworks that never touch the dollar, then the dollar's role as the default medium of exchange is undermined at its core. Sanctions, once the sharpest weapon in the West's arsenal, are accelerating this shift by freezing assets, cutting off banking systems, and punishing non-compliant nations. The West intended to enforce discipline. But in reality, it has created a race among targeted nations to find ways around the dollar. Russia, Iran, and others have already pivoted to non-dollar trade out of necessity. Their survival has depended on innovation, and those innovations are now available for other nations to replicate. Even countries not directly under sanctions see the writing on the wall. They understand that if it can happen to one, it can happen to any. The logical conclusion is simple: reduce reliance on the dollar before it becomes a liability. The fragility of the dollar's throne system also a story of shifting psychology. For generations, global leaders, investors, and citizens accepted the greenback as the safest store of value. It was the universal truth of finance: when all else fails, hold dollars. But this psychology is being tested. The 2008 financial crisis revealed that even American banks could collapse. The pandemic revealed that printing trillions could dilute value. Geopolitical standoffs revealed that reserves could be seized without warning. Slowly but steadily, the unshakable belief in the dollar is turning into cautious skepticism. And skepticism, once it spreads, becomes self-fulfilling. The less trust placed in the dollar, the weaker it becomes. And the weaker it becomes, the less trust it commands. At the same time, the world is not static. Trade routes are shifting, populations are growing outside the West, and technological revolutions are creating new possibilities. Africa, Asia, and Latin America are emerging as centers of consumption and production. These regions no longer see themselves as peripheral players bound to Western frameworks. They are creating their own trade agreements, their own financial institutions, their own visions of sovereignty. And central to all of these is the question: why continue to rely on a currency that ties them to the politics of Washington or Brussels? The dollar, once seen as the lubricant of global trade, is increasingly seen as a leash. The irony is that the dollar's dominance is both the West's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. It gave immense power, but it also created complacency. The West believed the system was eternal, that no alternative could arise, that control was permanent. This arrogance blinded leaders to the slow but steady erosion taking place beneath the surface. They mistook momentum for permanence. But permanence does not exist in geopolitics or finance. The British pound once held the same throne, and it too fell when history demanded change. The dollar is not immune to the same fate. What makes the current moment so critical is the speed at which change is now accelerating. The combination of technology, political will, and economic necessity is driving a momentum unlike anything seen before. Each new trade deal in local currencies, each new digital payment system, each new alliance outside the Western orbit pushes the world further toward a reality where the dollar is just another currency rather than the currency. The throne that once appeared indestructible is now shaking, and those who sit upon it know that cracks once formed rarely heal. For centuries, the narrative of progress, wealth, and innovation was written by the West. It was Europe that drove the Industrial Revolution, America that defined the digital age, and Western institutions that set the rules of global commerce. But the 21st century is not repeating the same script. A shift is underway, subtle in some ways, yet undeniable in its impact. The East, once portrayed as the world's factory or as a mere imitator of Western models, is now the architect of its own future. The rise is not only relentless, but multifaceted, economic, technological, cultural, and strategic. And what makes it unstoppable is that it is not built on a single foundation, but on an entire ecosystem of determination, population power, and vision that the West can no longer afford to dismiss. And canonically, the transformation is staggering. Asia now houses some of the fastest growing economies on the planet, with China and India at the forefront. Together, they represent more than a third of humanity, and their growth is not slowing. It is accelerating. China, despite internal challenges, has built an infrastructure empire within its borders and across continents, erecting highways, high-speed rail, and industrial zones at a pace the West can scarcely imagine. Its Belt and Road Initiative stretches across Asia, Africa, and Europe, binding dozens of nations into a network of trade that bypasses traditional Western control. India, meanwhile, has emerged as a technological and service hub, combining a vast pool of talent with rapidly growing industries that attract global investment. Southeast Asian nations, once overshadowed, are becoming manufacturing giants and digital innovators in their own right. The economic balance is tilting not because the West is shrinking, but because the East is rising faster, hungrier, and with greater coordination. Behind this economic surge lies a demographic reality that cannot be ignored. While Western societies grapple with aging populations, shrinking workforces, and unsustainable pension systems, the East enjoys the opposite: youthful, energetic populations eager to work, build, and innovate. This demographic advantage is not just about numbers. It is about vitality. It fuels consumer markets, provides labor for industries, and generates ideas that reshape industries. A young society is an ambitious society, and ambition, when combined with opportunity, creates revolutions. The West cannot replicate this demographic dynamic. No policy or strategy can reverse the tide of aging. But in the East, the momentum is natural, organic, and unstoppable. Technological innovation, once monopolized by Western capitals, is now the playground of Eastern cities. From Shenzhen's hardware revolution to Bangalore's software dominance, from Tokyo's robotics to Seoul's semiconductors, the map of global innovation is no longer confined to Silicon Valley. China has invested heavily in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and space exploration, signaling its determination to lead the next frontiers of human advancement. It is building digital currencies and satellite networks that operate independently of Western systems. India has demonstrated its capability with space missions that cost a fraction of Western budgets, but achieve remarkable success, proving that innovation is not bound by geography, but by vision. Even smaller nations like Singapore and South Korea are leading in cybersecurity, smart cities, and biotechnologies, challenging the notion that the West alone defines technological progress. Culturally, the East is also asserting itself in ways that were unthinkable just a few decades ago. Global audiences consume films, music, and literature from Asia with the same enthusiasm once reserved exclusively for Hollywood or Western publishers. K-pop fills stadiums worldwide. Bollywood dominates screens far beyond India, and Chinese cinema finds eager markets across Africa and the Middle East. This is not mere entertainment. It is influence. Culture shapes identity, and identity shapes alliances. As cultural exports expand, so too does the soft power of Eastern nations. They are no longer passive recipients of Western narratives. They are authors of their own. And in a world where perception is as critical as policy, cultural dominance becomes a vital instrument of power. Strategically, the East is no longer content with playing second fiddle in global institutions designed by the West. It is building its own frameworks, from financial institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to security alliances that bypass NATO's reach. Military investments are also reshaping balances of power. China has built a navy capable of projecting influence across the Pacific, while India strengthens its partnerships with regional powers to counterbalance threats. These are not isolated moves. They are calculated steps to ensure sovereignty and independence from Western dictates. The message is clear. The East will no longer operate under systems it did not design. It will create its own, and it will invite the world to participate. Another dimension of this rise is the East's approach to resilience. Unlike the West, which has grown accustomed to comfort and stability, many Eastern nations have histories marked by struggle, scarcity, and adaptation. This history has created cultures of resilience, societies that know how to endure shocks, adapt quickly, and recover stronger. Whether it is economic crises, pandemics, or geopolitical conflicts, the East demonstrates a capacity to absorb pain and convert it into progress. This resilience, often underestimated, is one of the greatest engines of their rise. It means setbacks are temporary, while momentum is permanent. Perhaps the most important factor in the East's rise is its long-term vision. Western politics often operates on short electoral cycles, with leaders focused on immediate popularity rather than generational change. In contrast, many Eastern governments and societies think in decades, even centuries. Infrastructure projects are planned with horizons of 50 years. Education reforms are designed for future generations, and technological investments aim to dominate industries yet unborn. This patience, combined with ambition, creates a trajectory that may appear slow in the short term, but proves unstoppable in the long run. It is the difference between sprinting and enduring a marathon. The West may sprint faster at times, but the East is running the marathon, and it is pulling ahead. The rise of the East also reflects a philosophical shift, where the West often preaches individualism and market absolutism. Many Eastern societies emphasize collective advancement, social stability, and balanced growth. This does not mean uniformity, but it does mean that their development models resonate with nations that reject Western prescriptions. For countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, the East offers an alternative, one that promises growth without submission, partnership without lectures, and sovereignty without compromise. This philosophical appeal is quietly realigning alliances, creating a multipolar world where the West is no longer the sole magnet of aspiration. The relentless rise of the East is not about replacing the West completely, but about redefining the global equation. It is about balance, about creating a world where power, wealth, and influence are shared rather than monopolized. The West may still hold significant advantages, but the tide of history is clear. The East is not waiting for validation, nor is it asking for permission. It is moving forward, building its own systems, exporting its own culture, and shaping its own destiny. To ignore this rise is to misread the world as it is. To dismiss it is to fall behind irreversibly. History is full of moments when power moved from one hand to another, when empires that seemed invincible crumbled and new forces emerged from shadows once overlooked. What is happening in the world today is not a temporary fluctuation or a passing phase. It is a structural transformation that is reshaping the balance of power permanently. The Western order, built over decades on financial control, cultural dominance, and military superiority, is colliding with a new reality. in which its hold is no longer absolute. The assumption that the old order could be preserved with reforms, sanctions, or temporary strategies is being disproven in real time. These global shifts have gathered such momentum that reversing them is impossible. They are now baked into the system, anchored in demographics, economics, and technology that no single power can unwind. The first marker of irreversibility lies in the economic reconfiguration of the world. For generations, global trade revolved around Western currencies, Western banks, and Western corporations. But in the 21st century, that centrality is dissolving. Emerging economies are no longer content to serve as suppliers of raw materials or cheap labor. They have become innovators, investors, and lenders. China's role as the world's manufacturing hub has been complemented by its rise as a financier and builder of infrastructure across continents. India has transformed into a global hub for digital services, pharmaceuticals, and space technology. The Gulf nations, once dependent on Western companies to extract and sell oil, are now building sovereign funds, investing in technology, and crafting their own long-term strategies for diversification. These changes are not reversible because they are no longer experiments. They are established realities with institutions, contracts, and networks that will only deepen with time. The second marker is the decline of Western monopoly over technology and knowledge. Once, the world looked to Western universities, laboratories, and corporations as the exclusive sources of innovation. But today, patents, breakthroughs, and inventions emerge from research centers in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Nations that were once dismissed as imitators are leading in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, digital currencies, and advanced manufacturing. China has become a leader in 5G and electric vehicles. South Korea dominates semiconductor technology, and India is carving its place in space exploration with missions that rival Western programs at a fraction of the cost. Knowledge, unlike territory, cannot be seized back once it is shared and expanded. The global diffusion of technology ensures that no single region can monopolize progress again. This diffusion is irreversible because the ecosystem of talent and resources has already spread too widely to be contained. Another pillar of irreversibility is cultural influence. Western dominance in film, media, and entertainment was once overwhelming. For decades, Hollywood was the world's storyteller. Western pop music was the world's soundtrack, and Western fashion was the global template. But now, cultural exports from Asia, Africa, and Latin America are claiming their place in the global imagination. South Korea's K-pop and dramas have achieved unprecedented global reach. Indian cinema attracts audiences in Africa and the Middle East, and African music genres are shaping global trends. Social media has accelerated this democratization of influence, allowing local voices to reach global audiences without passing through Western-controlled platforms. This cultural pluralism is not a trend that will fade. It is a structural reality. Once people discover that culture can be global without being Western, they do not go back to the old hierarchy. Geopolitics provides yet another demonstration of permanence. Western-led alliances like NATO and financial structures like the IMF once dictated the terms of global cooperation. Today, alternative institutions are rising. The BRICS bloc is expanding and exploring mechanisms to conduct trade outside Western frameworks. Regional organizations in Africa, Asia, and South America are strengthening their integration. These alliances are not symbolic, they are functional systems that provide alternatives to nations weary of Western conditionality. Even when Western powers attempt to use sanctions or restrictions to enforce compliance, nations adapt by creating parallel channels, bypassing the dominance of old institutions. Once parallel systems are in place and functioning, there is no going back to total reliance on Western structures. The shift is irreversible because the infrastructure of multipolarity has already been built. Military balance also reflects this permanence. For decades, Western superiority in weaponry, logistics, and intelligence was unquestioned. But investments in defense technologies by Eastern nations have shifted that balance. Hypersonic missiles, advanced drone warfare, cyber capabilities, and expanding naval forces are no longer exclusive to NATO or Western allies. The deterrence equation has changed. The very fact that Western militaries can no longer guarantee dominance in every theater of conflict proves that the old order has fractured. This is not about temporary setbacks. It is about the reality that technological parity has closed the gap, and no amount of spending can recreate the uncontested supremacy of the past. The role of demographics further cements the irreversibility of these shifts. The West is aging rapidly, with shrinking workforces and rising dependency ratios. In contrast, nations across Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America have young, expanding populations that drive consumption, innovation, and labor supply. Demographic trends unfold over generations, not years, and no policy can reverse aging populations once the trajectory is set. A young society naturally drives economic expansion and cultural dynamism, while an aging society struggles to maintain vitality. This demographic divide ensures that the momentum of growth will remain tilted toward the East and the global South for decades to come. Energy and resources add yet another dimension. The world is moving toward renewable energy, and while Western nations have technology, it is resource-rich nations in the East and global South that control the raw materials essential for the transition. Lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, and solar potential are concentrated outside Western borders. These resources are the oil of the future, and their control is diversifying power away from the traditional centers. Once supply chains and contracts shift toward new producers and partners, they establish patterns that endure. The West cannot easily claw back these advantages because geography dictates resource ownership, and those resources are no longer traded under one dominant system. Psychology also plays a decisive role in why these shifts cannot be reversed. For decades, many nations tolerated Western dominance because they believed there was no alternative. Today, alternatives exist, and with alternatives comes confidence. Once nations taste independence from a system that dictated their choices, they are unlikely to surrender it again. This is not just about economics or politics. It is about pride, sovereignty, and dignity. The psychological liberation from Western centrality is irreversible, and it fuels the determination of nations to build futures on their own terms. Finally, the irreversibility of these shifts is evident in the way crises are now managed. In the past, global crises, from financial meltdowns to pandemics, were addressed with Western-led solutions. Now nations look to multiple centers for aid, investment, and leadership. During the pandemic, vaccines, medical supplies, and logistical support came not just from the West, but from China, India, and Russia. In financial crises, nations now turn to regional banks and sovereign funds instead of relying exclusively on the IMF or World Bank. This diversification of crisis management mechanisms ensures that dependence on a single bloc will never return. Once nations learn that survival does not depend on Western approval, the old order is permanently broken. The global shifts underway are therefore not just visible. They are locked into the fabric of the modern world. They are anchored in economics, technology, demographics, and psychology in ways that no policy, no strategy, and no negotiation can undo. What is unfolding is not a cycle, but a transition, not a temporary deviation, but a permanent reset of the global balance of power. The West may continue to exert influence, but its monopoly is gone, and the rise of others is irreversible. Warnings in history are rarely taken seriously until it is too late. Empires have always believed in their permanence, convinced that their power, resources, and influence will stretch on forever. Yet, when collapse comes, it often comes swiftly, leaving little room to respond. Today, the West faces such a warning. The signs are written in its economies, in its politics, in its waning cultural influence, and in the shifting tides of global power. The message is not cloaked in ambiguity. It is direct, it is sharp, and it is final. Act now or watch the dominance that defines centuries vanish into memory. The West stands at the edge of a precipice, and the ground beneath it is cracking. The luxury of time is gone, replaced with the urgency of decisive action that will determine whether it adapts to survive or clings to arrogance and collapses. The economic foundations that once carried the West have become liabilities. A debt is spiraling, inflation corrodes living standards, and political leaders respond with short-term fixes that do little to solve structural weaknesses. Printing money may soothe markets for a moment, but it destroys long-term trust. Borrowing without discipline might delay the reckoning, but it magnifies the eventual collapse. These habits are not the marks of strength. They are the confessions of a system unable to reform itself. Without urgent restructuring, Western economies risk drowning under their own excess, leaving citizens angry, institutions weakened, and rivals emboldened. The warning here is stark. The old financial playbook has expired, and pretending otherwise only accelerates the decline. Political paralysis compounds the danger. Democracies in the West are trapped in cycles of division, where parties prioritize defeating opponents over solving crises. Electoral cycles demand instant gratification, not long-term vision. While rival nations plan decades into the future, Western governments are unable to plan beyond the next election. The result is stagnation disguised as debate. Critical issues, climate adaptation, technological advancement, industrial renewal are buried under partisan warfare. This paralysis weakens credibility abroad and stability at home. Allies question commitments, adversaries exploit distractions, and citizens lose faith in the very institutions meant to protect them. The final warning here is unmistakable. Without unity of purpose and the courage to think beyond short horizons, political systems will collapse under their own contradictions. Cultural power, long the West's most subtle and pervasive weapon, is fading. For decades, the West shaped the dreams of billions through its movies, its music, its brands, its lifestyles. To be Western was to be modern, advanced and successful. But that monopoly on imagination is broken. The rest of the world is producing its own cultural exports that resonate globally, reducing Western dominance to one voice among many. The spread of alternative narratives is irreversible, And with it goes the psychological supremacy that once reinforced Western leadership. If culture no longer guarantees influence, then the West must seek relevance, not through nostalgia, but through reinvention. The warning is clear. If the West continues to rely on past glories, it will become culturally irrelevant in a world no longer captive to its stories. Technological leadership, once an unquestioned advantage, is now contested ground. The West pioneered the digital age, but rivals have caught up and in some fields surpassed it. Artificial intelligence, renewable energy, biotechnology, and space exploration are no longer Western monopolies. Nations across Asia and beyond have invested in research and infrastructure with relentless focus. The West, distracted by political infighting and complacent in its past dominance, risks being overtaken. Technology determines not only prosperity, but also security and influence. Falling behind means dependence, and dependence translates into vulnerability. The warning is unavoidable. If the West does not reignite its innovative spirit with urgency, it will be reduced to a follower in fields it once created. Geopolitically, the West's grip is loosening. Its sanctions are resisted, its institutions are bypassed, and its alliances are questioned. New blocs are forming, new financial systems are being tested, and new partnerships are spreading influence across continents once under Western sway. The unipolar world has ended, and clinging to it is delusion. Multipolarity is here, and the only question is whether the West adapts to share influence or clings to illusions of supremacy. If it chooses the latter, it will isolate itself while rivals consolidate power. The warning is final. Adapt to the new reality of shared power or watch influence disintegrate. Demographics add weight to this urgency. Western societies are aging, their populations shrinking, their labor forces declining. This is not a challenge that can be reversed by wishful thinking. Meanwhile, the East and the global South are young, vibrant, and expanding, their populations fueling economies and innovation. This imbalance is permanent. Without rethinking immigration, labor policies, and social contracts, Western nations will face shrinking productivity and ballooning welfare obligations. The warning here is beyond dispute. Ignore demographics and collapse will not be gradual. It will be swift as economic vitality disappears. At the heart of all these crises is time, and time is no longer neutral. Every year that passes without decisive reform is a year the balance shifts further away. Every delay allows rivals to build stronger systems, deeper alliances, and more resilient economies. The clock is ticking, not in decades, but in years. Action must be immediate, radical, and unapologetic. Yet too often, leaders resort to speeches rather than solutions, to symbolism rather than sacrifice. This denial of urgency is the most dangerous illusion of all. The final warning resonates with absolute clarity. Time has become the enemy, and it cannot be negotiated with. There is still space to act, but that space narrows with each passing crisis. Reforming financial systems, investing in new technologies, rebuilding trust in politics, and embracing cooperation instead of domination are no longer choices. They are necessities. The West has the resources, the talent, and the history of innovation to recover, but only if it acknowledges the depth of the threat. Arrogance will seal decline. Humility may offer survival. Nations that refuse to adapt when confronted with irreversible shifts do not fade gently. They collapse abruptly. The choice before the West is no longer about preference. It is about survival. The warning is not for the distant future, but for the immediate present. Act now or accept irrelevance.